sensory deprivation as a video game. It's not something we see too often. Normally, in every game, it's very tangible. You can see what you're playing with. What does this do to a game when you cannot see what it is that you're looking at?
I think it puts the player into a place where they feel like it's a little bit of their responsibility to figure out what the game is about. And we wanted to create a sense of discovery throughout the game. So the player's not only discovering the world, they're also discovering what the game itself is.
Does it change the way that people think about games? It certainly will change the way they play it, but does it change the way they think about it?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of people really nervous, actually, which is something that we found early on and were a little frustrated by, and then decided, let's just take that and use that. So, we provided a bit more tangible goals for the midterm. So people, when they're standing in the spot, for example, they might see something 50 feet away that gives them a little bit of a clue about where to go. And we found that actually by providing them a little bit of structure like that, it gave them the freedom to relax a little bit, and then they could go off and kind of explore wherever they wanted, knowing that, okay, that's where you kind of want me to go, but I'm going to go, check out this thing over here instead.
And in talking to people, what was sort of the nature of people's unease with that kind of experience?
I think it's just a basic human drive of, when you're in a situation and you aren't sure what's going on, your first thought as a human is, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? So a lot of players, when they play the game, in the first 5 seconds or so, when they're just getting used to this idea of throwing, black paintballs in a white world, their thought is, well, what if I kept painting? What if I made this whole world black? And you can absolutely do that. And I think it was important for us to give players, the enough freedom that they could get themselves into kind of tricky spots, so that the world doesn't feel like it's entirely sanitized or safe. Like they're actually exploring a world that exists, outside of them.
Now, this is a game in which you have a white canvas. You're throwing paint around. Would you say that this is an artistic game? Is there a chance for people to be creative?
Yeah, I think there's a definite sense of personality to the way that individual people will play the game. I mean, no one splats exactly the same thing. There's just too many splats in the game to do that. But it's amazing how much character there is. So like an FPS player sometimes will start the game throwing paintballs everywhere and then make the world practically completely black, like they're attacking the world. Where other players, will be much more careful about it. And I think that kind of reflects the kind of person they are, which is exciting, that the way you play the game, is a reflection of the sort of person that you are in real life.
Now, as people play the game, of course, I think that they're creating a duplicate copy of it in their head, essentially. Mm-hmm. They're creating a copy of this world. So what kind of choices did you make in terms of the style of the world that you want to reveal to people?
I think we try to do as much as we can with audio. Was one of the things that emerged from that, was that people, in trying to get people to use their imagination, we found that things that were not necessarily tactile, like audio, were great for that, because there's no answer to what made that huge thumping noise. And maybe it's a giant, maybe it's just a door that's blowing, and it was really satisfying for players not to be told an answer. To have a world that was a little bit beyond, that you can't know everything, which I think is also that's true of life, that you don't get to know all the things that you necessarily want to.
Right. As people start to uncover the world, it becomes apparent that you're drawing influences from children's books. Why choose that particular influence? I mean, with a blank canvas, you could draw from contemporary art, you could draw from guys like, say, Damien Hirst, you could go in any direction. So that's an interesting choice. Why go in that direction?
Yeah, so it started off as a prototype. Just mechanically, it was, okay, you're in a white world and you're painting this world black. And it took a while to figure out what direction the game was going to go, because it's such an open thing. It could have gone a lot of ways. And I think for me, what was really interesting about that was this sense of wonder that you get from looking at a space that you don't understand and a situation that you've never been in. And we looked for things that had something kind of similar to that, this mix of sort of curiosity and fear. And children's storybooks were the best source of inspiration for that. And particularly things like Alice in Wonderland and Edward Gorey and Shel Silverstein had this really neat mix of a world that felt interesting and surreal and delightful, but also a little bit terrifying.
And the overall, I guess, goal for players once they become acclimated to the nature of the world is to do what? Is it to follow an adventure? Are there puzzles? What's sort of the end nature of the game?
So the short-term goal that people have in the game is they're playing a boy, Monroe, who's a young boy who wakes up one morning and finds, or one night I guess, and finds that this swan has stepped out of a painting and wandered off into this white world. And so players are chasing after the swan to try and find the swan, but they'll also, to discover what this space is. So it's very much Alice in Wonderland, replacing the white rabbit with a white swan.
Gotcha. And so obviously the name Unfinished Swan alludes to that. It's not just a vague kind of artsy title.
Yeah, no, there's a literal unfinished swan that the player is following after, and it turns out that the world that the player is going into is this unfinished space itself that was created by this kind of absurd king who has a magic paintbrush and created all these various totally impractical, audacious spaces, like labyrinths and giant castles and huge cities.
Now, something that surprised me in seeing today's demo is that immediately with a concept like this, it would lend itself to a lot of hard spaces in terms of corners, lines, strict geometry. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting to instead encounter things like frogs and monsters, things that are very organic, things that have animation and life, that move to themselves, that don't necessarily lend themselves to just being a shape discovered by paint. Talk a little bit about including those elements and working out how to get them into that world.
Yeah, it's a great question. Originally the game was just boxes, and part of that is because I was the only one who was making it and I'm not a very good artist. And so we started off for quite a while, and it was just a lot of boxy rooms or trees that looked like boxes. There's also some technical reasons for why like the splats just looked a lot better on these hard surfaces. And we found that after a while it felt really dead to have these spaces like that, and we wanted to find a way to interject a little bit of life because the world itself is somewhat deserted already. When the player arrives, the king who's created this world was not a very good king. He was a great artist, but didn't create a world that a lot of people wanted to live in. And so there aren't a lot of other people that the player is going to come across, and it was important for us to make the world still feel believable and like a place that might have sustained people. And so adding things like creatures that the player can encounter and even just physical objects that the player can move and see the splats bounce off of a box that is going to fall over and tip into a river and bounce along was a way that we could make the space feel a lot more familiar to people. So we have this, very surreal, unfamiliar space that we also wanted to feel, at some level, kind of familiar. So having things that, responded physically to the player was an important part of that.
Now, do you find in exploring something that is so different like this, that you have to at least devote the first part of the game or even the first game itself to just getting people on board with the concept, getting them acclimated for it, and then maybe it'll be later on that you can actually sort of explore the other ideas that have already accumulated in your head?
Surprisingly not. I think one of the biggest surprises actually in playtesting this game is how everyone seems to immediately be able to grasp this idea of a white world and splatting it black, that the human brain is amazingly good at finding patterns, and we do it all over the place. I mean, even seeing the face of Jesus in a tortilla or what have you, that we're already so good at that this is something that kind of plays to things that we're naturally pretty well disposed to. So yeah, we've had even people that have never played a first-person game before will be able to pick up the controls, and it takes them a little bit longer to make it through, but to date everyone has been able to make it through that first area at least.
And does that guide you in terms of the kinds of shapes that you include in the game? I mean, there are certain things like the human face that a mind picks up rather quickly. Just even a line and two dots. Hey, there's a face. Did you do a lot of research into sort of looking for that kind of iconography to include?
Yeah, no, definitely. We, when we started plotting out how the game was going to work, rather than look at like a top-down map, we really just had a series of moments, and we knew we wanted a moment where there's this shock of recognition of like a human face, and so that sort of suggested the rest of the space, and the environment evolved out of those beats, and try to figure out emotionally what we wanted the players to experience. And the splats themselves also, like, just even things like the radius of the splat, like how much you get to see influenced the design. And so, corridors and things would be like a little bit smaller, or statues might be a little bit shorter, just to, make the best use of the tools that we had given players.
And in terms of the relationship of sound, does the game know when to place? Does the game play sounds based on proximity, or is it based on what's been uncovered, as it were?
We try to have all of the sounds, or as many as possible, to be based on things that the player is doing. So there are sounds that, when the player throws a paintball against the surface, depending on what it is, will make a sound, which is, in our game, at least initially, when it's all black and white, one of the only ways that the player really knows the difference between, is this wood or marble or tin? And we found that, because we provided so few details to the players, that they really keyed in on that. And that was something that, we could do that would really enhance the experience for the players of trying to figure out and parse this kind of noise of black paint everywhere into something that felt like a real world.
And there's a degree of physics in the game. I guess you're not just painting the world; you're using paint balls to interact with the world.
Mm-hmm.
How does that sort of work in terms of creating designs? Are there actual? Is it more based on creating puzzles or experiences in terms of how the player interacts physically with paint?
Certainly experiences would be the primary goal for us. Again, we're trying to create an experience of awe and wonder. And we tried to make a game that had no puzzles at all, and we totally failed. There were some puzzles that ended up kind of sneaking in, and we found that there was after about 45 minutes or so of just straight exploration, it felt like a little samey, and so we wanted to vary it up and provide a reason for players to have to stay in one spot. So they've been exploring, like maybe a labyrinth or some large structure, and then we wanted them to explore something in a little bit more detail. And puzzles were a great way for us to get people to really focus on one particular aspect of the world.
And in terms of, you've done a lot of testing with people who have played it and never have played it before. What are you finding in terms of the emotional reaction? Are the emotions that people experience playing this game different from what we normally associate with other games?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so far the emotions have been quite varied. It's something that people respond to in a kind of primal way of, like, it's a question of, as a person, how do you respond to something you've never seen before? And some people, go to town and will splat everything and have a great time, and some people are a bit more cautious, and they seem to enjoy being cautious, and they're cautious in real life, so they will, kind of feel out spaces very gradually. And it really, it's something, the way that people play the game ends up saying, it seems a lot about the kind of person that they are in real life. So everybody, kind of brings their own life experiences to the way that they explore the game.